What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back with another Four Corners video for today's 4-game NBA slate, courtesy of Awesemo.com. It's just a few games to dig through today with some really ugly Vegas totals. So right now, like this video and leave a comment down below. Tell me which guy you feel the most comfortable with on today's slate. There's a lot of guys who are going to be very highly owned who I think are going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So right now, jump into the comments. I, of course, will join you guys a little bit later today. The first corner I wanted to hit on is a game with the Nets visiting the Blazers. This one is a 224-point combined total, which is a slate high. That represents a 1.2-point boost for Portland and a 2.3-point drop for Brooklyn. Yusuf Nurkic projects to be the highest owned guy at the slate at 45%. And we just saw what JaVale McGee did to this Nets team, putting up 70 fantasy points. I don't think it's the same situation from Yusuf Nurkic here. He's only been over 40 fantasy points once in his last 7 games. He's in a good spot. He's not in a great spot. I think the spot might be a little overrated by people who remember previous success versus the Nets and centers. So overall, I don't mind Nurkic here, but I'd want to go a little bit under the field because I think there are some guys with higher ceilings than him on the slate. Damian Lillard underperformed last time over the weekend with 50 fantasy points in a game versus Detroit. His price is up. His price is still a little bit up, though less than where it was in that game. He was at 10.1K on DraftKings. Now he's at 9,900. So I don't mind Lillard here. He's been over 63.5 fantasy points in 2 out of these 3 games without CJ McCollum as he went out with his knee injury. I think it's a nice spot for Lillard to again show that ceiling again. It should be a competitive matchup. And the Nets also a little more hospitable versus 3-point shooters than it would seem. So I think this is a good spot for Lillard at about half of Nurkic's ownership right now. Seth Curry's minutes been rising with 25, 28, and 32 minutes in that order in his last 3 games. The Nets will defend Seth Curry tightly, but I think the minutes are really what you're looking at here. He's going to have the opportunity. His shots have been there as well. So in terms of being a value guy, I don't mind Seth Curry one bit. Enes Kanter, Al-Farouq Aminu, and Mo Harkless all project for over 20% ownership without a ton of value on the slate. I like Enes Kanter a decent amount going against the second unit, but still, he's just a guy going against the second unit. Is the ceiling really there for him? I'm not sure. Al-Farouq Aminu, same thing. He's probably going to get a good amount of minutes, but does he really do enough? Is he productive in his court time enough to get there? I'm not really sure about that. Mo Harkless, same thing, just not shooting the ball a lot. So I'm not crazy about these guys. I think having a little bit of a taste of them is fine, but I try to find value elsewhere with these guys looking like pretty popular for value plays or value-ish plays without a ton of upside. It's been a long road trip for the Nets, with this being their 6th game in a row on the road on the West Coast. But D'Angelo Russell's usage rate's been pretty high throughout this entire stretch, over 32% in 7 out of his last 8 games. At just 14% ownership, I have no problem going back to Russell today after he was a guy I liked a lot on Friday. I think it's a little bit of a tougher matchup than it was versus the Lakers, but in that spot, I think you could see Russell be very competitive with Dame Lillard and actually trade buckets back and forth in a way which would make you want to stack these guys together. Joe Harris's 8 3-point attempts versus the Lakers were his most since February 11th. The Blazers are allowing 36.5% from deep, which should help out Joe Harris a bit if he does get those looks again. He and D'Angelo Russell both. So I don't mind Joe Harris is a little bit more expensive than the other value guys we talked about on Portland side, but a guy who could have a little more upside. DeMarre Carroll's 23% projected ownership right now looks fine if he's announced as a starter again after taking over Karis LeVert in that spot last game. LeVert off the bench, though, could steal some minutes versus a Blazers group who in that second unit really has nobody who can defend anything. So I don't mind Carroll here, but I think there's some risk for him if he's starting. And I think there's also some risk for LeVert as well if he's starting, just not getting a ton of usage in that group. Rather than taking the semi-value with these guys, it might be a little more logical to pay up for a guy like Spencer Dinwiddie, whose role is more secure. He's still getting shots. And I think he's actually playable alongside D'Angelo Russell with them seeing court time together and just Dinwiddie having a good enough usage role despite Russell having a much better one. Ed Davis had 29.5 fantasy points in 23 minutes when he played Portland earlier this year. This is his first time coming back to Portland, and although we know revenge games don't exist at all, I do think it is a situation where we could see Ed Davis have a decent day as a value guy, so I don't mind him here. I'm not as crazy about Jarrett Allen as a starter. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Sixers visiting the Magic. This one is a 218.5-point combined total, which represents a 2.2-point boost for Orlando and a 5.1-point drop for Philly. Nikola Vucevic had a 32.5 fantasy point dud versus Philly last time. Before that, though, he had games of 70.75 fantasy points and 51 fantasy points. He also played 41 minutes in that overtime victory versus Memphis, a really close one. The Magic are in playoff mode right now. They still have an okay shot to get in there. Not a perfect one, but they're still right in the cusp of making it. So I think you're going to see Vucevic continue to push that up, and as long as the Magic are close in this one, Vucevic will be on the court. Aaron Gordon had a brutal 13.75 fantasy point day versus Memphis, but he's averaged over 39.5 fantasy points in these 3 games versus Philly this year. At 20% ownership, I'd want to come close to that because he looks like a pretty steady play on a night in which a lot of guys who are going to have some ownership seem far less secure. Evan Fournier's had 2 straight games over 34.75 fantasy points after a really horrific run. I don't mind Fournier here. He's a very streaky player, so I think riding the hot streak right now at the field's ownership about 15% seems reasonable. DJ Augustine's price is coming up, but he's been pretty steady. He's also shown 40 fantasy point upside, so I don't mind DJ Augustine here. Not a perfect spot, but a spot where you could have some upside as long as this one is competitive down down the stretch. And the human whack-a-mole Terrence Ross had a big day versus Memphis, 44.75 fantasy points, but he seems due for some regression to the mean here. Also shot 8 for 12 from deep there. I don't think it's going to be as hospitable a spot. The 76ers do close out on shooters pretty well. So Terrence Ross could have an okay day, but I think chasing that high ceiling day seems pretty unlikely. Joel Embiid's been over 75 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. The one he faltered in was versus Atlanta. The one that he was really good in were games versus Milwaukee and Boston. So the Magic, also a playoff competitor. If we see Embiid go full effort today again, he can have a monster day. If we see him kind of play a little more lackadaisically like he did versus Atlanta, he's not. I think he's going to play hard today. I think this is going to be a tight matchup. I think it's going to be a competitive one on both sides. So I like Embiid quite a bit here at under 10% ownership projected right now. Jimmy Butler's had over 44 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. He's also been getting some more lead ball handling time and time with Ben Simmons on the court as well as off. I think Butler's been looking better. People haven't fully caught on to it, and his price isn't fully caught on to it, but I think Butler's in a nice spot again today. Ben Simmons struggled hard versus Orlando earlier this year, but got back on track in that last game without Joel Embiid versus the Magic. I think he's in a good spot. He's been over 51 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games, so Ben Simmons has been getting there recently. I don't know this is a perfect spot for him. I think you're going to see some usage pulled the other ways. I don't mind Ben Simmons here. I'm not crazy about him. I honestly would personally prefer both Butler and Embiid. And part of the reason I don't quite love Ben Simmons as much is there's going to be a lot of usage probably going to JJ Redick or Tobias Harris, maybe both. These guys have really showed up for games versus their former team in the Magic. Redick has averaged 35.25 fantasy points versus the Magic this year, and Tobias Harris is over 46.25 fantasy points in 2 out of the games he's played versus them. So these guys have brought it to their former team in the past. Revenge games, of course, do not exist, but guys' motivations are there, and it is a spot matchup-wise where it may work for both. So I don't mind these guys, and I do think they may pull enough away from Ben Simmons, and maybe even Jimmy Butler, where those guys get a little bit less valuable. Next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Thunder visiting the Grizzlies. This one is a 218-point combined total, which represents a 3.4-point boost for Memphis and a 2.5-point drop for Oklahoma City. Mike Conley's questionable, but he did go through shoot-around, so it seems like he should be in there today. He's projected for 42% ownership right now, which just seems high to me. I think there are some better plays and games that are a little more competitive and just a little better overall. So I don't mind Conley here, but I think that ownership number does feel a bit high for him. Tyler Dorsey also projected for 44% ownership. He obviously had that big 49.75 fantasy point debut versus Orlando as a starter. He also put up 17.75 fantasy points in a game versus Minnesota, which was sort of a blowout, but it was mostly the results of the starters and everybody getting staggered minutes on a back-to-back. So Dorsey could be in a good spot to come back, so he's still pretty cheap. I would prefer him if Mike Conley were to be scratched. But I think overall, Dorsey's an okay play as value, just a guy who probably is going to have that 50 fantasy point ceiling again, maybe ever again, but especially not in a day in which Conley is on the floor. Jonas Valanciunas' performance, I feel like, is a lot more repeatable. He's been over 48 fantasy points in his last 3 starts. Joakim Noah's doubtful right now, so that could be some more minutes for Valanciunas too. It's a spot where I think he's in a good situation, going to get those minutes, not a back-to-back for Memphis. So Jonas to me looks like a really strong play at center and a very viable pivot to a higher-owned use of Nurkic. Delon Wright's been scoring at least 30 fantasy points in games with no Avery Bradley. He's in a good spot to do that again. There's going to be some pace here versus the Thunder. So don't mind Delon Wright, especially on a day in which people are trying to force some cheaper value in there. Delon Wright's at least got a very secure floor. Chandler Parsons' minutes were also limited on a back-to-back, but he had 28 plus fantasy points in his 3 games before that one. So I think Chandler Parsons is a guy who I would be willing to go to his value. I think he's going to get some more minutes today. It's a nice spot for him as well, so I like Chandler Parsons a decent amount. The 30% ownership projected for Paul George is the most on the Thunder side, and I think the defense of Bruno Caboclo can stifle him a little. It's certainly not in the way that Kawhi Leonard did, but Caboclo's given some guys fits, as we talked about. Aaron Gordon had a terrible day, largely due to Caboclo, so I think he can slow down George enough, but really, George at 30% seems pretty fair to me, and again, he's just a good play night in, night out with his price where it is. Russell Westbrook's going to be slightly less owned, but I think he's in a slightly better matchup than Paul George, so I would likely prefer Russell Westbrook, even though he's going to be a bit more expensive than George is. But to me, this is also a spot where you can go to George and Westbrook in the hopes the Grizzlies keep it close. Game stacking some Grizzlies, especially the value guys like I talked about, would be a good situation to go to with them and then run it back with George and Westbrook. I don't mind that approach for a build at all. Jeremy Grant and Dennis Schroeder both seem like better options than Steven Adams to me at this point. Adams has only gotten over 29 fantasy points once in his last 9 games. Grant's been more involved on offense. Schroeder also shooting 16 times a game in his last 3. If people still want to roster Steven Adams and have him in there, he just doesn't have the upside right now, and I think especially versus Jonas Valanciunas, he really doesn't have that upside. The last corner I want to hit on is a game with the Suns visiting the Jazz. This one is a 216.5-point combined total, which represents a 5.1-point boost for Utah and a 6.2-point drop for Phoenix. Ricky Rubio's had over 37.25 fantasy points in games versus Phoenix outside of his last one, which he saw just 22 minutes. There's bad defense here, and bad defense for a point guard like Rubio is so assist dominant. can mean that he still hits value even if this game blows out. A lot of assist upside for Rubio here, some scoring upside as well, so I like Rubio the most of the Jazz players. Rudy Gobert has been over 47 fantasy points the 2 times he's played Phoenix this year. He's about as steady as you can get. I like the other center plays that we've discussed more from an upside perspective, but Gobert is steady, and maybe the steadiness might be what you need if some of those other games do go sideways. Derek Favors projects for 36% ownership right now, and that seems pretty high, but I get why you'd want to go there. He's shown 41.25 fantasy point upside versus Phoenix this year. He's been in a good spot before where he's coming off the bench behind Rudy Gobert, gets full usage in that second unit, so I don't mind Favors here, but again, that ownership just feels a bit too high. Joe Ingles, Jay Crowder, and Donovan Mitchell are all sort of similar plays to me at different price points, but they still offer the same thing. They can score, they can put up points here, but I think in this current situation with the Jazz, they're not getting enough peripherals to really have value, especially with a game with a 15-point spread that could blow out. I don't want to trust those guys today. Devin Booker's been the only Sun showing up, both literally and figuratively, with a bunch of guys getting injured, being ruled out for the season, and just missing a game. So I think it's a spot where Devin Booker's fine, but I really worry about him keeping this close by himself if there is going to be no Josh Jackson today. Josh Jackson is questionable right now with an ankle sprain. He's shown a ceiling of 51 fantasy points versus Utah this year. He's also shown a floor of 12.25 fantasy points. I think the Suns need him to keep this one close or even keep it within range where you're going to see these guys on the court in the 4th floor. So Jackson's status to me is a key to watch. DeAndre Ayton does show improvement as he plays competent centers more, and this is going to be the 3rd time he's seen Rudy Gobert this year. There's too many good center plays though to really want to go to Ayton. I think he's interesting maybe as a contrarian option. Like 10% ownership is where the field's going to be with him. I think that's fair. Anything more than that though, you're getting a bit too cute on a slate like this. Jimmer Fredette's a guy a lot of fantasy players are curious about, but he got just 4 minutes his debut for the Suns. It's possible he gets more minutes here. There are still just a need for anybody who can score on the Suns side. But if he's not announced as a starter, I don't want to go there at much volume because of the risk involved. 4 minutes is not enough, obviously, to get anywhere. Even a guy like Jimmer Fredette, who is the king of China. So no Jimmer Fredette for me today, unless he were announced as a starter early, in which case I think it's a time to load up on some Jimmer. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on today's 4-game slate. So like the video right now and leave a comment down below. Tell me which guy you feel the most comfortable with on the slate. Can have some really highly owned guys who I think are going to make you feel a little bit out of sorts. So please like the video right now, leave a comment or any questions, and I'll jump in there later today. And while it's still NBA season, check the promo code Switch and Hedge. Get half off your first month on any package at awesemo.com. So if you want to be covered for baseball too, get an all sport package, get half off that as well. Get all the ownership projections and rankings from Awesemo, who's the top player in the world, as well as premium content, premium Slack as well. A lot of people talking in there every day, sharing news, sharing items, sharing stuff they're doing with their lineups. So use that promo code Switch and Hedge, get in there for half off your first month. I'll be back again tomorrow for another 4 Corners video, so good luck.